Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry you've got the graveyard slot with me. What I'd like to say first is thank you very much to my sponsor, HDB Beef and Lamb, in particular Clive Brown, because he was the first one to get this sponsorship for the Beef and Lamb AHDB group. And also for the Nuffield Farming Scholarships Trust for giving me this opportunity, which I really didn't think was a possibility for me. My Nuffield journey was a bit of a challenge, and I have to give particular thanks both to Mike Batcher and to HDB Beef and Lamb for supporting me through what was quite a traumatic first 6 months, just being able to do a Nuffield scholarship and then to slightly modify my topic of study. As well as a challenge, it was a change. As a vet working in my area, I'm not used to being with a big group of farmers who are kind of smiling at me and engaging with me. Well, I'm not quite sure if you are now. And normally if I turned up at a farm or in a court, it would be on the other side of where the farmer generally was stood. I also have to thank Kiwi family for looking after 3 of my children so that me and my husband could trip around Tasmania, Australia and New Zealand. So although he wasn't doing a Nuffield scholarship, he did get to do quite a lot of his own interests, which is more to do with notifiable diseases. I have to say sorry to my children for having not very good holidays in the last 2 years and smaller Christmas presents. And also I nearly ended up delivering my first grandchild this year, and gave a paramedic really good training in their first live birth. And she's doing very well. Now, the themes I wanted to cover, there were 3, and I apologise for my voluminous report. I've been told not to apologise for it, but dip into the bits that you're interested in. One area I looked at was advice, and how advice was taken by farmers and how they made decisions. This particular farmer here, he's actually a UK best-selling author in the Inspector Maclean novels, and actually it's his partner, wife, that does most of the decision-making on a day-to-day basis and around how they run their farm. The other area I wanted to look at, if it appears, were farmers' actions and interventions, and how they understood the impact of their actions or their inactions, and how that impacted particularly on the calf and calf survival. And you can see this chap here is all ready to go with his colostrum replacement. He's also ably supported by his partner, who supplied the wine bottle. And I also wanted to look at bigger data. I initially focused on big data, but I realised I was more focused on looking at country-specific issues around bigger data, and how bigger data could help the individual farmer, and how that could possibly influence them changing. I'm not going to focus on where I went or on who I met, really, because I wasn't looking necessarily for innovators, although I did meet them. I was just looking to talk to farmers. I'm trained as a vet to analyse something, sort out what the problem is and fix it, and give my noble opinion on that. So actually sitting down with a farmer for maybe sometimes up to 3 to 4 hours as they told me their whole kind of life story and how they ran their business was quite a new venture for me. So what did I find, or rather what did the farmers tell me? I was quite interested in what they thought of vets. And as far as beef farming was concerned, they were clearly split in 2 sides. One that saw vets in a positive light, and those that saw vets in a less than positive light, and saw them as a cost to the business and something that had to be limited. When I asked them about when they were making management changes to their beef business and who they would seek advice from, generally, most of them would only speak to peers or family when making pretty major decisions. Some just spoke to themselves. Some spoke to their family, but it didn't always end up going the right way. Those that consulted what I'd say were more of the specialist advisors, so your agronomists, your agricultural advisors, your vets, and maybe going to research institutes associated with their countries. They usually recognise that they were not perfect at everything and that there were smarter people they could speak to. Meat processors, customers, nutritionists, banks, agents, those with a vested interest with who they were supplying, they were slightly less trustworthy of. And I think my conclusion overall was really whether they spoke to their vet, for example, or their bank manager or the meat processor, with the level of trust they had with that person, which is why it was so much easier for them to speak to family or to their peers and other farmers down the road, because they felt they could trust them more and that they'd get an honest opinion from them. The role of the specialist advisor. This chap in Cape Grim in Tasmania had got it completely right as far as getting the right advice, because his wife was a secretary and she did all the paperwork for him. And then he grew children and made sure that they moved into various bits of agricultural business. So he grew an agronomist and he grew a vet. And he realised, having spent a lot of money on training his vet student daughter, he realised how much she was learning and actually how much she could give back to him. And so he actually moved from a position of maybe calling the vet on an ad hoc basis to having the vet as an integral part of his business, and maybe calling her every other day to mainland Australia to talk about how the business was going. In another example, Colombia, which had been affected by civil unrest, and the Republican army of Colombia had taken over lots of places, and they'd taken over a lot of farms and killed the livestock. And in this particular example, the farmer got his 8 farms back after maybe 15 years of unrest. And he was just pleased to get his stock back, but realised quite quickly that he needed help in improving productivity and survival. In the end, it was his mate down the road, another farmer, that said, hey, get the services of this other vet, and if you get him along to help you, I bet you'll see big changes. He wasn't willing to invest that veterinary advice in all 8 farms. He thought he'd test him out on 2 of them. And within 6 months, he doubled production on those 2 farms, and he'd reduced calf mortality by half. So he had made a difference. But it wasn't just from his veterinary skills. He'd set forward particular standard operating procedures on the farms, where there were staff employment issues if they didn't do as they were told, and following specific procedures, for example, to reduce the likelihood of mastitis and calf death. Then he replaced them. And he made sure that the management and the full running of the business was going to suit positive turnaround in a very quick time. I'm only going to give you a few examples of the other work that I looked at within my project. One was on keeping records. And essentially, most of the farmers that I interviewed were only really seeking to record what was required on a minimum basis. It didn't really matter whether this was legal requirements or whether to meet assurance scheme requirements. Generally, most of them were only doing what they had to do, and quite often didn't see it as a positive tool. Indeed, those that spent a hell of a lot of time working on estimated breeding values, particularly, they felt that it was completely ruined when somebody came along and said, right, I want the biggest bull you've got. No interest whatsoever in all the work he'd done in keeping records regarding these animals. Again, just one example on calf records because of time. Very few farmers were weighing calves regularly, just for an example. Some of them never weighed them at all through from birth to finishing. And there wasn't a country-specific approach to this. It was very random as to whether people weighed their calves at birth and then onwards after that. And what can be done with bigger data? And I think the take-home message is, whatever you do, be ever so careful with it and understand what's underpinning that data when you read anything about statistics. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but this shows the spread of age at first calving from 20 to 36 months. So it's not really a huge data set. This is just the farmers I interviewed. But actually there were 2 breed types covered here. The the Bos Taurus type that we will be familiar with and would tend to be calving down at 24 months. And then the Bos Indicus type, where you find them in drought-type countries, and they will be tending to calving down at a later time, and they're slower maturing. So you do have to be clear what the data is telling you. Another one was those who actually fed colostrum to their calves. There's quite a range in volume. And again, you need to be quite clear about the questions you're asking, because when you actually split this down, those that were feeding quite small volumes of colostrum, if you followed them up with additional questions, they were more likely to be giving additional colostrum, maybe within the next 6 hours or 12 hours. Those giving a large slug of colostrum were less likely to then follow on. So again, be very careful with how you look at data and make sure you split it accordingly. But what can bigger data do at a farm level? Because this is what I was really interested in. Isle of Man had a data set from January 2014, just accidentally really, on the back of some additional controls relating to BVD. It meant that everything was recorded, including stillbirths. So unlike some of the other data sets, for example, in the UK, where you might have missing data, there was nothing missing because it was a government contractor that picked up the dead calves. So unless there was an odd lime kiln hanging around or something, then every calf was identified in some form or other. Now, he had increasing mortality over 3 years, a particular farmer, and it was over 3 times the mean for the Isle of Man beef breeders. So I took the whole data set of 180-odd beef farms and looked at their mortality over those 2.5 years. And here you can see a plot of 2014 and 15 births. So they were dying at quite a young age. And when you investigated this further, this chap was expanding and finishing all of his own beef, but hadn't made any changes to buildings. He'd accidentally introduced IBR and BVD into the herd and did have an active vaccination program for IBR and had plans to act on the BVD, but he was still having these problems. And I looked at the data set and I could see no obvious effect of dam age, parity, sex of calf, bull, and date of birth. And from date of birth, I mean the sequential date within that calving block, because traditionally you would tend to see an increase in mortalities as the calving season went on. None of this was there. And the lab results were suggesting IBR, which I really didn't agree with, because the data and evidence, the very few stillbirths, it didn't fit with an IBR pattern. And so I questioned the timing of blood testing, and I think this was potentially an issue. And when we actually went and looked and talked to him, and I did have another graph here, but you can't see it very clearly. But when you look at what he was doing and the way he was expanding his business, he was actually having a crossover between finishing cattle and calving. And when you looked at the buildings that he was using, he was probably not using appropriate biosecurity between finishing animals leaving and then calving cows coming in to calve. So it didn't matter how much colostrum those calves were getting. If they were getting an overwhelming dose of bugs, like coccidiosis and rotavirus, it really didn't matter. So we think that's what his problem is. So a whistle-stop tour through my project and my report, and I have a number of recommendations. You do need to make better use of vets and specialists and recognise your own limitations, but also recognise the limitations of your vets and agricultural advisors. And if they're not doing what you want them to do, then maybe go elsewhere. Make better use of the records you keep, and I think try and see them in a positive way. If you've got to keep them, then make use of them and look at them and try and take that time to go through them and see how they can help you in decision making. It may be that we need minimum record requirements essential if we want to know certain things, just because it's a very individual thing, keeping records, and you could go to different countries and find where there were no laws at all. There'd be somebody that kept records on absolutely everything, almost in a kind of OCD type need to record everything, and others just wouldn't record anything at all. With regards to government and scheme orders, scheme owners, they should and can give back to the wider industry. If they're demanding that you have to do certain things, you have to record things which you then have to produce on audit. maybe they can turn those data record inputs into meaningful outputs, as I did for this particular farmer on the Isle of Man. It's not really just benchmarking and sending a sheet of paper to you saying, look, you know, your mortality is rubbish compared to the rest of Northern Ireland or Ireland, for example. It's about looking at it from an individual farm's point of view and really trying to pinpoint, if you've got a calf mortality problem, when is it happening? Where is it happening? How is the business being run? And this is being done in some countries, but we're still lacking in calf data. And we need more detail on calf records if we want to understand the issues. Most of the calf records we have are associated with the dam, with the mother, not with the calf. And we also need better communication between farmer, vets, industry and government. It's not just the evidence base and me here saying this is what you need to do. It's about how we communicate it. And we're all different and we all respond to different ways of dissemination. And you always listen more so to farmers than you would to me, for example. And that's it. Thank you.